On my 30th birthday, the room smelled like money I never had. My parents were smiling too hard, talking too loudly, pretending too well. And then my grandfather walked in. He raised his glass, looked straight at me and said, "Cairo, how did you spend your $3.4 million trust fund?" My throat closed. I blinked once, twice. What trust fund? Silence cracked the room open. My parents went pale like someone had pulled a plug in their chest. My grandfather didn't even flinch. He just turned to them, calm as stone, and asked, "Where did it go?" In that moment, I realized two things at once. This wasn't a celebration, and my whole life, everything I thought I knew, was about to split in half. My name is Cairo Lennox Hale, and what happened next reshaped everything I believed about family loyalty and survival. Before I share my story, I want to know you're here with me. Just say "listening" in the comments, or tell me where you are. I love hearing how far my story can reach. Sometimes even the smallest connection can make a story feel heard. Thank you. And now, here's my story. And if this kind of story resonates with you, feel free to subscribe. It helps more people find these moments, and it lets me know someone out there cares enough to stay. I had always told myself that the draft slipping through the cracked window frame, the rattling pipes behind the thin kitchen wall, and the faint smell of rust from the old radiator were a small price to pay for freedom. My apartment in Portland was cramped, outdated, and barely held together, but it was mine. It was the one place where my parents' expectations and curated perfection couldn't reach me. They lived in Lake Oswego in a 3-story lakefront house designed to look like an architectural magazine cover. And every conversation with them felt like a performance. They talked about charity galas, golf tournaments, and European trips as if the world existed solely to be impressed by them. Whenever I tried to share what was happening in my life, my words barely lasted a few seconds before dissolving into their monologue about status. Most days I drowned myself in freelance work, sitting for hours in cafes with wobbly tables and humming espresso machines, trying to hit impossible deadlines just to keep my bank account above zero. I had taught myself to survive with little. I had learned that lesson early. In college, my parents told me they wouldn't cover my tuition because self-reliance built character. When graduation day arrived, I didn't receive help with my loans, just a book titled "Financial Independence for Young Adults." I smiled for the photos, then went back to my part-time job to make another loan payment. The only person who truly understood the strain between me and my parents was Jasper Quinn, my roommate. Jasper had this talent for looking at me and knowing the weight I was carrying even before I did. He'd always tell me that I'd lived too long under responsibilities that were never mine to begin with, and that one day something would break open. That day came sooner than I expected. I was finishing a logo revision for a tech startup, my biggest and only steady client, when the email arrived. They had gone bankrupt overnight. Every contract, including mine, was terminated. I stared at the screen, reading the short message again and again until the words lost meaning. Then I opened my banking app and saw the number I feared, just a few $100s left. It felt like standing on the edge of something I couldn't see the bottom of. I sat there stunned, wondering how much longer I could keep patching holes in a life that had already worn thin. And that was when my phone lit up. It was my mother. A part of me hoped she could sense something, that she'd hear my voice and notice the fracture beneath it. But all she wanted was to remind me to dress appropriately for my birthday dinner in Seattle. When I told her I had lost my biggest source of income, she barely paused before telling me not to ruin the mood with negativity. Then she hung up. Hours later, I sat alone in the dark of my apartment, listening to the wind push against the old window frame. And I wondered how long I could keep enduring a kind of loneliness that only comes from the people who were supposed to know me best. I packed lightly for the trip to Seattle, though every item I folded reminded me of how little I owned. Spending what remained of my savings on a bus ticket felt irresponsible, but I knew my parents would never tolerate an excuse, especially not on my birthday. On the ride north, I watched strangers chatting, laughing, or dozing peacefully in their seats, and I envied them. They seemed unburdened, untouched by the constant pressure of proving their worth to people who never asked who they were beneath the surface. When I arrived in Lake Oswego to stop by my parents' house before the dinner, something felt immediately off. A brand new luxury car I'd never seen sat in the driveway. The scent of an unfamiliar designer perfume floated through the hallway, My parents greeted me with stiff smiles, and beneath their polished exterior there was something tightly coiled anxiety, maybe fear. My mother dodged every question I asked about finances or recent renovations. My father, usually stoic and distant, was suddenly overly warm, as if rehearsing kindness. Nothing felt natural. Then came the first crack. While passing the kitchen, I heard their voices, low but sharp. My mother whispered, "We can't tell him yet." My father hissed back, "We don't have a choice. We need the right moment, just not tonight." I froze where I stood, but when they walked out and saw me, their faces lit up with those same rehearsed smiles, like nothing had happened. Later, Jasper video called to check on me. I said I was fine, but he looked at me as if he could see the storm gathering behind my eyes. I hung up faster than I should have, not wanting him to see the truth. Lunch with my parents was no better. They spent nearly the entire meal bragging about how much they'd spent upgrading the house, how they had hired a new interior design team, and how they'd booked a luxury vacation to Europe. I listened quietly, my appetite shrinking with every word. Then came the moment that lodged itself in my mind. I gently asked if they could help me cover part of next month's rent because I had just lost my job. They refused instantly, almost indignantly, saying I needed to learn how to manage money like an adult. But when my father looked away, I caught something in his eyes, guilt or fear or something darker. After lunch, while clearing the table, I noticed an open drawer by the china cabinet. A folder with my name printed on the tab sat inside. I reached for it instinctively, but before my fingers touched it, my mother swept in and slammed the drawer shut. She forced a smile, changed the subject, and guided me to the living room as if I were a child. That was when the truth began to settle inside me. My life hadn't just been shaped by their expectations. It had been shaped by secrets they had kept from me for years, maybe decades. And whatever those secrets were, they were waiting for me in Seattle. I left the house and headed toward Canlis for my birthday dinner with a heaviness in my chest, the kind that tells you a storm is coming long before the clouds appear. When I stepped into Canlis, the first thing that struck me was how warm the room felt despite the winter outside. Golden light draped across polished glassware, the piano drifted through the air like it belonged to another world, and every table seemed to glow with the kind of affluence I had spent my whole life looking at from a distance. Yet even in the middle of my own birthday celebration, I felt like a guest who had wandered into the wrong story. My parents were seated at a large round table in the center, both dressed in shades of elegance that matched the room too perfectly. It was clear they had requested a prominent table. Everything about them said, "Look at us. Look how well we are doing." When they saw me, they greeted me with overly bright smiles and polite enthusiasm, but nothing in their voices hinted that they remembered our conversation from the night before. They didn't ask about my work or the stress I'd been carrying for weeks. Instead, they asked if I had seen the new wine list or whether the traffic from Portland had been bad. Their words skimmed across the surface of everything real, never sinking in. Dish after dish arrived, each more elaborate than the last, and I heard compliments and half-hearted toasts swirl around me. Yet inside, all I felt was a hollowness that kept widening. My parents kept their posture impeccable, their sentences polished, their laughter curated. I wondered if anyone else in the restaurant could see through them, through us. I wondered if anyone else sensed the tension humming beneath the tablecloth. Then the air shifted. A staff member opened the door at the front of the dining room, and the room seemed to pause. My mother's hand jerked so sharply she dropped her napkin. My father rose halfway out of his chair as if bracing for impact. Standing in the doorway was my grandfather, Augustus Hale. He did not rush. He never needed to. He moved with the kind of ease that came from decades of being the most powerful man in any room. As soon as he reached me, he wrapped his arms around me in a warm, steady hug, the first genuine moment of the evening. I asked why he hadn't told me he was coming, and he smiled like he enjoyed the secrecy. But the shift in my parents was impossible to miss. They exchanged glances full of panic, as though his presence threatened something they were desperately trying to protect. My mother fussed with her hair. My father's knuckles whitened around his water glass. They looked like two people caught in a lie before anyone even accused them. Then came the moment that split my life in half. My grandfather lifted his glass, looked at me with a calm so absolute it was almost chilling, and said, "Cairo, how have you been spending your $3.4 million trust fund?" The words didn't make sense at first. They hung in the air like a language I didn't speak. My hands went cold. I blinked at him, my throat tightening around the only response I could form. "What trust fund?" I said. The entire room froze. My parents went pale in a way I had never seen. They looked like they might collapse. My grandfather didn't even blink. He set his glass down gently, then turned to them with a voice that carried more weight than the walls around us. "If he doesn't know," he said, "then tell me, where did it go?" The silence stretched until something inside me felt like it might crack open. My mother stuttered. My father swallowed hard. Their panic made the entire restaurant fade into the background. I suddenly understood why they had been tense, why their smiles had been forced, why their eyes had darted everywhere but at me. They were hiding something enormous. A moment later, the staff moved quickly to prepare a private room. My grandfather placed a steady hand on my shoulder as he guided me toward the back. My heart hammered against my ribs as I walked behind him, knowing without being told that every unanswered question in my life was about to demand its explanation. And I had no idea how much those answers would change me. The private room felt colder than the dining hall. The walls were lined with frosted glass panels that reflected the overhead lighting in sharp angles. When the door clicked shut behind us, the sound carried a finality that made my stomach twist. I stood there surrounded by my parents, my grandfather, his attorney Thatcher Cole, and his assistant Alara Wynne, and I realized I had stepped into a confrontation that had been building long before tonight. My grandfather signaled for Alara and Thatcher to begin. They moved like they had rehearsed this. Alara handed me a folder with my name printed across the top. The weight of it felt ominous. Inside was a detailed record of a financial account I had never seen before. A trust fund. Mine. Established the year I was born. My vision blurred slightly as I read. The numbers were staggering. The account should have grown to more than $3 million. But the balance listed was $72,000. Everything else, every dollar that should have secured my future, was gone. Thatcher began to read out the transactions: payments for home renovations at Lake Oswego, purchases of luxury vehicles, jewelry, international vacations, a failed business investment under my mother's name. Each line felt like a blow. I looked up at my parents, searching their faces for something, remorse, explanation, anything. But they didn't meet my gaze. My father stared at the table. My mother pressed her lips together as though trying to hold herself together. Then came the next revelation. A massive withdrawal used to buy a beach house in Cannon Beach. The property was worth more than most people made in a lifetime. My name wasn't on the deed. Theirs was. They had used my trust fund to buy a second home and never told me. A wave of disbelief washed over me so strong I had to grip the table to stay upright. When I finally found my voice, I asked why. Why hadn't they told me? Why had they taken the money? My parents mumbled something about managing it for my future, claiming they worried I would waste it. Their excuses dissolved the last remnants of the illusions I'd held about them. This wasn't oversight. This wasn't protection. It was betrayal. My grandfather stepped forward, asking Thatcher to present the property deeds. The documentation showed clearly that my parents had claimed ownership. They hadn't just used the money. They had claimed what was supposed to be mine as theirs. Even then, my parents reached for excuses, insisting this was all done for my benefit. I stood there hearing them justify years of deceit and felt something in me fracture. It wasn't the money that hurt. It was realizing they had never believed I was capable of managing my own life. My grandfather's voice cut through the tension. He revealed that he had suspected foul play long before tonight. For months, he had asked them to provide financial transparency, and every time they had stalled or provided incomplete information. What was unfolding now wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern. A long, deliberate one. I stared at my parents, realizing that everything strange I had noticed these past few years, the tension, the new purchases, the secretive behavior, had all been pieces of a larger truth I hadn't been allowed to see. And now it was all laid bare in front of me. My grandfather closed the folder and turned to me. His expression was calm but firm, the way someone looks when they know the next step will change everything. "There is something even more serious we need to address tonight," he said. My pulse quickened. I felt the ground shift again beneath my feet. Whatever came next, I knew this was only the beginning of the storm. I had thought the worst part was hearing the number. 72,000 left from a fund that should have secured my entire future. But as I stood there staring at the folder on the table, I realized that number was only the doorway. The real blow came when Thatcher placed another stack of documents in front of me and said there was more I needed to see. The air in the room pressed in on me, thick and unmoving, and my heartbeat grew so loud it felt like metal striking stone inside my chest. He walked me through a series of bank statements and loan agreements tied to my name, lines of credit I had never applied for, mortgages I didn't know existed, secured loans backed by assets I didn't even know I owned. My throat tightened when Thatcher paused over one file and said it would be especially painful. It was the deed to a small piece of land my grandfather had gifted me when I was 13. I remembered that day clearly, standing beside him, as he told me the land was something solid to lean on when I grew up, something no one could take away. Yet there it was right in front of me, stamped and recorded as collateral on a loan my parents had taken out years ago. They had gambled with something that was supposed to anchor me. Everything inside me twisted. Memories I had cherished, holidays, old conversations, moments I thought were genuine, shifted under the weight of what I was learning. I felt something sharp and cold settle behind my ribs. The betrayal didn't come from the money. It came from the ease with which they had rewritten the meaning of everything my grandfather had given me. Then Alara stepped forward with another folder. She explained there had been repeated transfers from the trust account into an offshore account registered under the name of someone my mother knew, a distant acquaintance barely connected to the family, someone who should have had no access to anything belonging to me. The implication was clear. My parents weren't just spending carelessly. They were hiding money. I asked them directly. My father lowered his eyes and said nothing. My mother clasped her hands together so tightly her knuckles turned white. They didn't need to answer. Their silence said everything. Then Thatcher reached into his briefcase again and pulled out 2 airline tickets. Printed in bold letters were the words Buenos Aires, along with a departure date 2 days from now. One way. My breath stopped in my chest. They had planned to leave the country, planned to run from everything they had done and leave me with the fallout. I turned to them, shocked at how small my voice sounded when I asked why. They began to cry at the same time, their words tumbling out in fragments about protecting the family's reputation, preventing scandal, keeping everything from spiraling out of control. I listened to them speak and felt the last threads that connected us loosen. They hadn't thought about me. They hadn't thought about the damage they were doing. They had only thought about themselves. My grandfather stood silently for a long moment before he finally said that this wasn't the first time they had been in financial trouble. They had been overspending for years, living beyond their means, scrambling to fill gaps by using whatever was available, including me. It wasn't a single mistake, it was a pattern, a life they had chosen at my expense. I looked at my parents then and understood something painful and undeniable. I had lost them long before tonight. I just hadn't known it. My grandfather sat down and folded his hands. He told me calmly that everything in the room could be in court by morning if that was my decision. He wouldn't push me either way, but he wanted me to understand that whatever choice I made would change the path of every life in this family. I stared at the thick piles of paperwork in front of me. My name on documents I had never signed. My future rerouted without my knowledge, and 2 people who had put their comfort above everything else. My hands trembled slightly as I closed the folder. For the first time in my life, I wasn't thinking about what they wanted. I was thinking about what I needed. The room faded into a blur as I understood that the decision was now mine and mine alone. Everything from this moment forward would depend on the choice I made next. 3 days passed before I could sleep more than an hour at a time. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw documents scattered across the restaurant table, airline tickets glinting under fluorescent light, and my parents' faces shifting from defense to desperation. When the summons came to meet at the Hale Dominion headquarters, I felt something inside me harden. This wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a reckoning. The headquarters towered over Seattle, all steel and mirrored glass. I rode the elevator to the top floor with my pulse thudding in my ears. When the doors opened, I saw my parents already seated at the long conference table. They looked different, smaller somehow. My father's shoulders slumped, my mother's eyes rimmed red. They didn't greet me. They barely looked at me. My grandfather sat at the head of the table, hands folded, gaze steady. He asked me to sit, and I did, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this room. My parents spoke first. They said they were sorry. They said they hadn't meant for any of this to happen. They said they would repay the money in installments, that they only needed time. Their voices trembled just enough to sound sincere, but before I could even process their plea, Thatcher placed new documents on the table. Records of attempts to move asset statements that didn't match timelines that contradicted what my parents had just claimed. Their story crumbled under the evidence. I told them I needed to think. I wasn't ready to decide anything yet. That was when my father's voice sharpened. He said that if I had just been more successful, if I had shown more ambition, they wouldn't have felt pressured to dip into the trust, as if my lack of achievement had forced them to break the law. The words hit harder than any number on any statement. It was the kind of accusation only someone who had stopped seeing you as a person could make. My grandfather stood abruptly, ignoring their protests. He announced that all assets derived from the trust were being placed back under my name, effective immediately. The properties in Cannon Beach and Lake Oswego were already under temporary court order. The room went completely silent. My mother covered her face as tears spilled down her cheeks. My father stared at my grandfather with an anger that had no place left to go. Then Thatcher read the official notice: both houses would be seized until further hearings, bank accounts frozen, and all financial activity monitored. Hearing it spoken aloud made everything real in a way the documents hadn't. My parents were about to lose everything they had built their identity on. My grandfather looked at me again. He asked what I wanted to do next. Whether I chose to pursue legal action or walk away, he said he would honor it. But the decision had to come from me. I stared at the two people who had raised me, who had shaped me through silence and pressure and expectations. People who had made their comfort my responsibility, their mistakes my burden. And I realized I no longer feared disappointing them. I no longer needed their approval. What I needed was to protect myself from them. I told my grandfather to move forward with everything, to take it to court. My mother's breath hitched. My father muttered something under his breath, but he didn't stand, didn't fight. Thatcher slid the final documents across the table and asked them to sign, acknowledging the investigation. Their hands shook as they wrote their names. With each stroke of their pen, the distance between us widened. When it was over, I stepped out of the conference room and felt the air hit me like a new season. I didn't know what waited on the other side of this decision, but I knew one thing for certain. There was no going back. The morning of the preliminary hearing felt unreal. I woke up in my new South Lake Union apartment, sunlight stretching quietly across the wide living room floor, and for a moment I didn't recognize where I was. After years of squeezing through narrow hallways and living with the drone of old pipes, the stillness here almost felt like a mistake, as if I were occupying a life that didn't belong to me. I stood for a while at the window, staring at Lake Union's muted shimmer, trying to settle the unease in my chest. When I stepped outside, the chill in the air did nothing to steady me. As I approached the courthouse, I saw reporters clustered on the steps, microphones raised, cameras pointed like sharpened lenses. The Hale family's scandal had made its way into the public record, and the press wasted no time turning it into a headline. Seeing my last name on their clipboards made something inside me twist. I realized then this was no longer just our family's secret unraveling, it was a public unraveling. Inside, I saw my parents waiting with their attorneys. My father, usually immaculate to the point of obsession, looked disheveled, hair, unkempt tie, loose eyes, bloodshot. My mother's complexion was gray, and her posture, once so disciplined, was slumped. I felt a flicker of pain despite everything. They weren't the towering figures of my childhood anymore. They were simply two people watching their world cave in. Before the hearing began, I met with my grandfather and the court-appointed lawyers. They informed me that my parents' new legal team planned to argue that I had known about the trust fund and neglected to manage it properly, that I had somehow contributed to the financial discrepancies. I stared at them in disbelief. Even now, when the walls were collapsing around them, my parents still found a way to make me the shield that absorbed the impact. It was almost astonishing how deeply that instinct ran in them. When we entered the courtroom, the judge began by asking each party to explain what had happened to the trust over the last several years. My parents' attorneys painted a picture of temporary borrowing, of parental concern, of protecting their son from impulsive financial decisions. They made it sound noble, almost generous. But hearing those words, knowing the truth, knowing the deception, made something sour rise in my throat. Then Thatcher stood. His voice was crisp, unwavering, as he placed new evidence before the court records, showing transfers from the trust into an undisclosed account in Nevada, one connected to a shell company not registered under either of my parents' names. It was clear, deliberate concealment. Not a mistake, not poor judgment. Intentional misdirection. My father sank back into his chair. My mother pressed her fingers to her forehead as though trying to stop the room from spinning. Watching them break in front of strangers should have made me feel something familiar. Fear, guilt, obligation. But I felt strangely numb. The prosecutor then turned to me, offering a direct proposal. If I agreed to testify fully and cooperate, the case could move swiftly and all remaining assets rightfully belonging to me would be restored without further dispute. The implication lingered in the air. My cooperation would almost certainly send my parents to prison. My heartbeat fluttered painfully. I had never imagined being placed in a position where choosing justice meant handing my own parents over to the consequences they had earned. But the memories poured in late nights, wondering why nothing ever felt stable. Years of scraping by alone, their contempt disguised as encouragement, their dismissal of every struggle I had faced. The lies, the manipulation, the silence. Before I could speak, my father stood abruptly. His voice cracked as he declared that he had acted under my mother's direction, that she had orchestrated everything that she had insisted, persuaded, pushed. My mother's expression collapsed. She stared at him as if she didn't recognize him, and for the first time, I saw the facade of a united front fall apart completely. They weren't protecting each other anymore. They were scrambling for individual survival. The judge called for order as their attorneys tried to contain the chaos. I rose slowly, my knees trembling but my voice steady. I told the court I would cooperate fully. I said I wanted the truth acknowledged and the law to follow its course no matter where it led. A quiet settled over the room, heavy but resolute. By the end of the session, the judge approved the seizure of assets pending trial and moved the case to the next phase. My parents looked at me like I had become a stranger, someone they couldn't reach or manipulate. And for the first time in my life, I didn't look away. When I left the courthouse, I felt exhausted, but I also felt taller, as though some invisible weight I had carried since childhood had finally loosened its grip. I returned to my apartment that evening, expecting relief to wash over me, but instead a quiet emptiness settled in its place. The sky over Seattle was blanketed with a thin veil of fog, and the city lights blurred softly through it. Standing in my living room, I felt suspended between loss and liberation. The court had done its job, but the ache of what had been broken lingered in my chest. In the weeks that followed, the case progressed quickly. Every asset tied to the trust fund was frozen, then reclaimed. The Lake Oswego house, once the symbol of my parents' pride, was seized. Their accounts were locked. Investigators uncovered more loans, more discrepancies, and more attempts to hide spending. With each revelation, the picture sharpened. This wasn't just mismanagement. It was a long-standing disregard for consequences. Then came another discovery: an apartment in downtown Seattle purchased using the trust fund and registered under the name of a distant relative. I had no memory of this person ever being part of my life. yet their signature appeared on almost every relevant document. When the court ruled the property belonged to me, I held the deed in my hands and felt something unfamiliar disbelief mixed with sorrow. Every asset returned to me was proof of another layer of deception. Before the final hearing, I drove to Tacoma to see my parents at the motel where they were staying. The room smelled of stale air and damp carpet. My father didn't lift his eyes when I walked in. My mother looked at me as though she still expected to negotiate something. She asked if I could retract my testimony, though she knew the trial was already too far along. When I stood to leave, my father finally spoke, not to apologize, but to ask if I could help cover their attorney fees. The request cut deeper than anything they had done. Even now, in the midst of everything, they still saw me as a resource, not a son. I told them quietly that I hoped they would learn what they needed to from all of this. Then I turned and walked away without looking back. Life in South Lake Union slowly took shape after that. My freelance work began to grow thanks to referrals from companies connected to my grandfather. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was surviving, just living. I could breathe without waiting for something to collapse beneath me. One evening, my grandfather invited me for dinner in his office. The city glowed behind him as he told me he had established a new trust. This time he said I would be the only one with access, the only manager, the only decision maker. He'd watched me fight through years of hardship, and he wanted me to build something for myself now, unshadowed by anyone else's mistakes. I told him that what I wanted most wasn't wealth. It was the feeling of having someone who stayed. He placed a hand on my shoulder and said that sometimes family isn't the people who raise you, but the people who choose to stand beside you when everything falls apart. As I left Hale Dominion that night, my phone buzzed. It was Jasper, practically shouting with excitement. A major Seattle firm had seen my recent design work and wanted to partner long-term. A new chapter opening just as the old one finally settled into silence. That night I stood on my balcony overlooking Lake Union. The water was calm, the city breathing slowly below me. I thought of the boy I had been. The boy who never felt enough, who carried weight that wasn't his, who kept waiting for his parents to see him. I wasn't that boy anymore. I whispered into the cool air that this wasn't a victory over my parents. It was a victory over the version of myself who thought he had no power. I hadn't just reclaimed what was mine. I had reclaimed myself. In the quiet that followed, I found myself thinking about how strange healing really is. It doesn't arrive with fireworks or grand declarations. It comes in small breaths, in mornings where the weight on your chest feels lighter, in moments where you open your eyes and realize you're no longer bracing for impact. Standing on that balcony, watching the city shift from day to night, I understood something simple but profound. Survival had shaped me, but it didn't define me anymore. I finally had the chance to build a life based on choice, not damage. And that realization alone felt like reclaiming a part of myself I didn't know I'd lost. Maybe that's the quiet truth hidden in painful chapters like mine. We don't always get the apologies we deserve. We don't always get the closure we hoped for. But we can still move forward. We can still decide who we become after everything falls apart. And sometimes choosing yourself, really choosing yourself, is the bravest thing you'll ever do. If you're still here with me, thank you. It means more than you know to have someone listening on the other side of this story. And before you go, I'd love to know you were here. Drop a hi in the comments or tell me where you're watching from. I read them, every single one, and it reminds me that even the heaviest stories can find their way into shared space. And if you'd like to stay for the next chapter or the next story that might feel a little too familiar, you're welcome to subscribe. It helps these stories reach the people who need them, and it lets me know I'm not speaking into an empty room. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying. And wherever you are tonight, I hope you find your own version of peace the way I finally found mine.